if you like. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us today. Today we welcome Dr. Constance Duncombe from Monash University, who's talking to us about her research on the visual politics of Twitter. So Connie has been working on a range of, I guess, topics around critical power, politics and recognition and identity, and the politics of new media, and has published in a whole range of journals on these topics, including EJAR, International Affairs, and Global Change, Peace and Security. And we're really excited to have Connie here today to talk to us about this particular topic, which is something I think most of us can relate to, at least in our everyday lives, using Twitter and seeing the images. So I'll hand it straight over to you, Connie. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Danielle. Thanks so much for having me here today. I just want to start off by saying I'm really looking forward to any comments or criticisms you have. This is an ongoing project, so it's still very much a work in progress. So I'm really excited to kind of extend my thoughts on this, particularly in light of any kind of ideas people might have in response. So I'll try.
Can I pause you, because this is totally my fault, especially in NAIDOC week. I totally forgot to do an acknowledgement of country, which is something I should have done before I had you start. So I just want to acknowledge that we're all meeting today on the lands of the First Nations people that were never ceded. And we're based in different parts around the country, but I'm calling in from the land of the Kulin Nation. So I just wanted to make that acknowledgement, and I'll hand back over to you now.
Thanks, Danielle. Yes, I too am zooming from the lands of the Kulin Nation, and I recognise that sovereignty has never been ceded. And yes, so which is a really important point, I think, in terms of the politics of recognition, particularly around NAIDOC week. So thank you very much for reminding us about that. In the context of the talk today, what I'm looking at is how states respond to social media images as part of kind of challenging or accepting key identity frameworks, and how this is implicated in visual representations of how states, political leaders, diplomats, and the kind of the body politics that they represent wish to be recognised. So sorry, I'll just go back here. So what I'm actually trying to do with this particular paper that I'm presenting here is to create or generate some kind of conceptual framework for how we might understand the political power of Twitter images. So what I'm attempting to do is to create a conceptual framework that connects elements of see, touch and feel, and how people engage with Twitter images, and what this tells us about global politics in general. So, images have, for a long time, in international relations, at least, I mean, fairly recently, we've had the visual turn, of course, but there's a recognition that images are really powerful, that images are polysemous, they have different meanings for different viewers. There's contestations about how images are created and then what that means in terms of the audiencing around that. So often you don't have necessarily people either work on the content of the images or the impact of the images themselves. And sometimes those two aspects don't necessarily overlap. But the important thing in terms of how this relates to diplomacy explicitly is that images are used as visual representations of key identity frameworks that either represent emotions or can provoke emotions. And this can be key to ameliorating diplomatic crises, like the image here of John Kerry extending condolences to President Rouhani's brother and Rouhani himself on the passing of their mother, which was a really pivotal moment in the JCPOA nuclear negotiations. The negotiators representing Iran had to leave to go back to Iran to take part in this, mourning process. And it was understood that that was actually a very tricky time. And they were worried that this might, further inflame tensions around the negotiations. But actually, it became a moment where John Kerry, as representative of the State Department of the US, used social media and also an official statement to convey his condolences, signifying empathy or sympathy at the very least, which then linked to a kind of a situation where there was trust that the negotiations could continue. So images in diplomacy have, we recognize that they can provoke emotions, empathy, sympathy, they can provoke anger, disgust, humiliation. But these are all very complex feelings. And again, as I mentioned before, because the images have different meanings, sometimes these can be drawn upon for unintended, consequences. So an image that a state or diplomatic representative might tweet might actually not necessarily intend to inflame particularly problematic responses, but nonetheless this does occur, and we can see that across a number of different elements there. So the argument that I'm trying to make here is that what makes Twitter images slightly different, which I know will be a very controversial argument here, is that they're both material and image-based. So the visual affordances that underpin these images, Twitter images. The studies exploring the link between digital images and policy making, particularly images and diplomacy, have really yet to consider. So, and the visual in this sense cannot be understood outside of this rich, immersive experience of Twitter, which simultaneously engages users through physical and affective registers. So it produces this, what I say is a potent space where visual signals of misrecognition are more acute, which are driven by public-facing social media platforms in ways that are not commonly appreciated. And so what I'm suggesting here is that there's a complex interrelationship between these aspects of the user experience that underpin this utility of Twitter as a site for the production and contestation of identity. So my argument here is that in developing this conceptual framework to understand the role of Twitter images in the politics of recognition, that there's an interaction between the aesthetic, material, and embodied aspects of Twitter images that are important elements of visual social media practices, which contribute to how we experience and interpret these images themselves. So first, there's key visual elements that shape the meaning of how we see Twitter images and the potential for their political effects. Second, the tactile nature of Twitter changes how we interact with still and moving images. And third, the experience of viewing an image on Twitter can heighten how we feel about an image, drawing us into the space of the platform while simultaneously existing offline. So there's an intertextuality here of these elements that mean they are at once delineated yet interrelated and ultimately integrated into the user experience of the platform and how we perceive and understand these images. So understanding how this deeper embodied experience unfolds allows us to consider the intersection between images, disrespect, and the struggle for recognition. So the intensity and temporality of tweeted visual representations of identity underpins claims to emotional authenticity, which make Twitter politically potent, particularly the images. So success in Twitter terms, as Brett Hutchins has argued, is predicated on a greater emphasis on transparency. It's parallel to authenticity and trustworthiness. And emotional authenticity is the cultivation of genuineness, honesty, or truthfulness through public displays of emotional dispositions has therefore become a commodity of power, whether it's instrumental, whether it's an instrumental display or not. So it lends emotional credibility to claims of disrespect, which in turn affords legitimacy to identity claims surrounding recognition and misrecognition and the policy decisions or, maintenance or change that results from that. So the image I have there is a very well-known image of tweeted by China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian, who tweeted a photoshopped image of a grinning Australian soldier, as you can see there, holding a knife to the throat of an Afghani child, and captioned with the words, "Don't be afraid, we're coming to bring you peace." The image showed the soldier and the child crouched over an Australian flag, which was draped on the floor. Now, I didn't realise this, but obviously this is, I think, Scott Morrison showing a picture of the actual tweet, but there under the Australian flag are bodies of people taken to have been killed by the Australian Special Forces. So this is what that photoshopped image is supposed to represent. So there is still a debate about this image as well. The Australian claims that it's photoshopped, whereas in terms of the person who created the image says that it's an artistic rendering. So like so even in terms of the composition of the image, there's a debate there. So that goes again to the idea that images are polysemous. So it really challenged this idea of Australia's representation of itself as a good international citizen, middle power, an identity that's formed through militarized myths of mateship and mutual sacrifice in war. And so what was interesting about this is not only that the diplomatic uproar that it caused and the kind of challenge or contravention of the kind of diplomatic engagements over Twitter. So there was an added element of it being quite new in terms of this, and the reaction that it gained internationally as well, which was an Australian-China dimension, but then it became international in terms of, France and the UK and other European nations and New Zealand, responding to it. But the fact that the Morrison government responded within 2 hours of this being tweeted suggests that there was something else going on there that makes it particularly have a traction with state identity dynamics as well. So this is the kind of, why is it that this image in particular was then co-opted by, the Morrison government as part of this, Australia-China relationship, dimension, but then also how this contributed to cycles of political, like conflict that then had significant economic and political consequences for both Australia and China that is still ongoing. So this image is part of this kind of, what do you call that? Disintegrating relation, Australia-China relations, but also signifies a particular co-opting of identity frameworks to challenge national identity, but then that then is harnessed by the Australian government to signal that this is actually profoundly problematic and therefore means that, provides an avenue for policy change that might not necessarily have been there before. Okay, so put simply again, as I talk about kind of 3 interrelated but delineated elements of Twitter images that contribute to visual social media practices. So it's the aesthetic, the material, and embodied aspects that make Twitter images so powerful. So again, this is a very provocative argument. I'm sure people will have particular views on this, which is going to be very interesting to talk about as well. But in terms of the visual affordances of Twitter, as part of this, I examined the aesthetic practices that shape how users see Twitter images. So there are 3 key visual elements that form and change the meaning of the image. So we've got circulation, remediation, and anchoring. And these images shape, affordances, shape images according to the platform vernacular of Twitter, and are thus key to how politics is seen via that space, which Lever and Highfield have argued. So circulation is incredibly important. So it's not related to the production of visuality of the image itself, but it's about the circulation over this public-facing social media platform allows images to be shared in real time, making photographs and videos of events visible to a global audience as they unfold in the moment. So a lot of work has been done on the speed of communication, how this blurs the boundaries between domestic and foreign audiences, such that the distinction between the two is meaningless, but also how states have to respond in time and how trending algorithmic elements drive the circulation. So it creates this space where people who are not on Twitter still see these images because of this hybrid media system where traditional media are now very reliant on statements and claims made by political leaders and others over Twitter as a form of news. So in this sense, there's a very interesting dimension here where it's a visual kind of, as Zapavigna has argued, it's visual co-presence, whereas in the moment affordances driving Twitter intensifies the temporal nature of photographic images, because as they're coming through, we feel that we are there, we can see it, we engage with these images through this circulation dimension. But we also participate in this through this remediation, which is the second important aspect of the visual affordances of Twitter. So the interface allows us to increase the richness of these images through the addition of emojis or emoticons and retweeting memes and GIFs as part of this kind of having a connection to what Marina Almeida calls cultural resonance through co-creation. So it provokes some kind of mass participation because it becomes this common language. So the remediation through emojis and emoticons, or, using memes, like some of the more recent ones, how it started, how it's going, or that one, I think it's from, I want to say Star Wars. I'm probably really wrong, but it has Natalie Portman in it. Those kinds of things where people can actually create, and draw on those memes and then create their own and tweet them out. So this becomes part of that broader visual discourse of what's actually going on there. And finally, anchoring is a significant element that shapes meaning around Twitter images. So it's important to note that images themselves don't necessarily convey or produce new information about key political events, as scholars such as Adler-Nissen, Anderson and Hansen have talked about. But what makes it so powerful is that these images become co-opted and embedded in particular epistemological terrains of politics, which can shift the discourse around key issues. So we often see this argued through examples of the Alan Kurdi image and how that the claims around that in terms of shifting the discourse from migrants to migrants and refugees allowed for an opening of acceptance of more refugees through European nations, following the tweet of his image and the discourse shift around that. But there's also arguments that say, well, then that got repurposed and resulted in a hardening of borders as well. But nonetheless, what this shows is that anchoring images through hashtags and other kind of meaning-making language technologies amplifies the visibilities of these images across two different levels. So firstly, in terms of this hashtag-defined discourse, and secondly, in terms of the visible identification, categorization, and situalization of an image through these kind of communication spaces. So there is a lot of work in media and communication studies that goes through this. This is the second element that I'm going to talk about. So I have a third one. So I realize I'm just on the 20-minute timeline now. So I'll kind of see if I can speed this up a little bit. But key here, so those elements of Twitter about the visual elements, they're logical, right? So it's like, that's not necessarily anything new, but what I'm saying is there's this integration of actually how we see that remediation, how we see the circulation or experience the anchoring of those images. Because what we do in terms of the majority of people who are engaging with these kinds of images is through the smartphone. So there's a physical capacity here that is really underappreciated when we're looking at the role of images in diplomacy and social media images in particular. So touch is an integral component of the visual affordances of Twitter, as the visual is constituted as this tactile experience. So if images are not singular artifacts that sit still on gallery walls or other fixed locations, as someone, I've just got a quote there and I put the year, but I don't know who said it. I'll have to go back and find it. They must necessarily require other experiences or senses to interpret them. So here, this is why touch is an incredibly important part of Twitter as a visual experience, because think about how we use our phones, for instance, to engage with Twitter. We use touch and scroll, use our fingers to scroll through the tweets on our homepage. We touch and open or scroll past images. So even though we might not engage with an image, it's never actually hidden, because as we scroll through, we are seeing it anyway. So it's connecting the user to an offline and online space through this experience. So Twitter images are both optical and tactile. So the digital nature of images means that they are as much about multisensory feelings as they are about seeing, which is something that Heidi Ray Cooley and Louisa Moore go into when they talk about the issue of screening, which is not necessarily about smartphones, but it's about, a different kind of dimension there. So what we're seeing here is not only the material hardware of viewing Twitter images, but it's also the integration of the body. So there's an element of embodiment here that goes on when we see these particular images. So rather than simply being passive, what we're seeing is that, people participate and enact these images through using their fingers and thumbs to physically manifest greater spread and attention of these digital images through the pressing of retweet or like buttons that then frames the outside of the image. So there's a perception of the image is therefore part of the relationship between the image and the user. So each time people tweet or retweet or like an image, the user is communicating something about their sense of self, their identity, and signaling, why it's important. And so we can see here the kind of physical manifestation of that. And finally, we get to the part about feel. So the tactile nature of Twitter produces an embodied experience of emotions provoked by how images are seen, drawing the user into an affective space beyond themselves. So it's an emotional experience, but it's not a singular encounter. So the technological affordances of Twitter allow for the spread of emotions through this viral expression, as Ross goes through. So social media images are powerful because they are constituted through these emotional registers, which are in turn derived through embodied affect, whereby the individual users are connected to a broader community formed through these shared feelings. So what we're seeing here is that the public nature of social media can produce temporary shared moments of emotional contagion. So a number of neuroscience and media and communication studies have shown, circulations of affect or circulations of emotions you don't necessarily have to be in the same space as someone. This actually can occur online, but it allows this material body connection allows the user to be immersed in the experience of seeing, and so the body becomes an integral part of social media practices that then allows the emotions to be physically embodied in the person. So it's not just about representation of emotions, but it's also about how they're experienced and felt at that point in time. Now, I'm just going to briefly go into what this means. So we can talk about this as part of the question time as well. But here, okay, so we've got see, touch, and feel. But what makes Twitter images so politically powerful? Well, millions of images are tweeted every minute. So every time we scroll through our Twitter homepage, we're exposed to hundreds of images at any one time. There's only so much visual information to process and access, such that our capacity to judge a tweet as valid or not, as relevant or not, is constrained by the incredible speed of communication, blurring our online and offline social lives. So in diplomacy and diplomatic engagement, this kind of challenges conventional practices because considered, reasoned judgment runs contrary to the flow and speed of information on Twitter and the programmability of the platform that requires this instantaneous response. So our desire to respond in kind is further facilitated by this emotional pull of tweets, particularly those enriched by images, which undermine slower thinking and reflection normally associated with what some might call validity judgments. So this produces potentially a different rationality where claims to the truth are represented and assessed according to the speed of information and the emotions they engender. So what we see here is that Twitter, the affordances of Twitter, as I've gone through, not only condition what we see, but how we see these images and respond emotionally to them. So I've got like just a brief outline of the kind of conceptual framework that I'm trying to get at here, which is that drawing these elements together, we can see a way forward for thinking through the political power of Twitter images and their role in cultivating or challenging authentic representations of state identity and what that might mean. So the first step is to think through the key visual elements that shape the meaning of how we see Twitter images and the potential for their political effects. Secondly, the tactile nature of Twitter images changes how we interact with still and moving images. And thirdly, the experience of viewing an image on Twitter can heighten how we feel about an image, drawing us into a space within the platform while simultaneously existing offline. Fourthly, the intertext of image, body, and emotion are integrated into this meaning-making process, consciously or unconsciously. And finally, a hierarchical yet intertwined practice of see, touch, feel becomes the decisive crystallization of a powerful moment of misrecognition, which then emphasizes the role of Twitter images in this process. So recognition, therefore, I argue, as part of this is important. It's the link here is that recognition is a visually intersubjective process, which is not commonly appreciated when we're thinking about recognition and misrecognition dimensions. How we represent and recognize our others is intimately connected to how we see ourselves and our role in the world. And because of this incredible shift to digital diplomacy, Twitter images are going to be a significant part of the strategic representation of identity and how it's constructed and articulated, including claims to emotional authenticity that are taken as part of challenging or rejecting visual representations presented by other states. And we're seeing this increasingly happening. And so states become involved in cycles of political conflict that emerge from certain Twitter images that undermine representations of identity. We can see that through debates about the images articulating maps of certain areas, images that claim to challenge state identity dynamics in terms of what, for instance, Australian soldiers are doing in Afghanistan. Even the decision to not image a political leader meeting with another political leader, such as Trudeau and Modi. And Modi's decision not to do a selfie with Trudeau at the beginning of his India trip really signals very strongly key emotional dimensions that are connected to claims about identity on both parts, in terms of both parties, and how this can play into particular complex political dynamics that either undermine or, in a positive way, reaffirm, political relationships between states. So I will just leave it there. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your comments. Okay, so should I stop sharing?
Yeah, let's stop sharing so that we can see each other a bit better. Thank you so much, Connie. I'll start off by asking.
I know it's a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot there, so I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions. And as unsurprisingly, Maria has, who's been working on different issues around Twitter, has the first question. So I'll pass straight to you, and then to James, and then to Umut.
Thank you so much, Connie. I really enjoyed that. And as Danielle said, I work in the area of political communication, and I'm developing a research project about the affective nature of podcasts. And so this is really exciting, the way we hear politics. So I thought your conceptual framework was really great about the see, touch, feel. And you already raised, this is going to be controversial, but because I'm always asked what's the difference between podcasts and radio, I'd really like to hear more about your distinction between Twitter as opposed to another platform like Facebook or Instagram, or maybe even TikTok now, maybe.
Yeah. Should I take this question or keep going? I can respond to it right now. Yep. Thanks very much, Maria. That sounds fantastic. I totally get the podcast thing. My partner is really into podcasts. Like listening to people, I think, is part of a different auditory response, generates a lot of it can be quite provocative, in terms of what you're hearing and how it makes you feel, which is really interesting. So I'd love to hear more about your work. That's a really good point. So In terms of the distinction between Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, I guess for diplomats and diplomacy, Twitter, because of the way in which it's structured, is a much easier, much more recognizable format for political communication in that sense. So certainly diplomats, like the majority of ministries of foreign affairs and diplomatic counterparts, have both a Twitter and a Facebook. Certainly, in different regions of the world, the platforms obviously vary quite differently in terms of how people are using them and how many people use them. But the difference with Twitter is that it's continually, I guess, on your home page, right? Everything is so short and the remediation is so quick, whereas Facebook, it kind of requires a lot. The emotional labor behind it is quite different because it seems to be connected to people's sense of self individually in some way, whereas Twitter the emotional dimensions are much more, I don't want to use this term aggressive, but there's a particular component there that what makes Twitter work is the punchiness of it. So I think that is what it is. So it's less about the images themselves and how the kind of algorithmic dimensions shape how they're seen. And Facebook, you can, and also Instagram, you've got more of space for anchoring those images in longer stories, so it takes longer and you're reading and engaging, and it's kind of maybe the emotional dimensions might be shifting because you're reading more, whereas Twitter, it's kind of very much in your face. And I think that's something that in terms of diplomacy they're still particularly kind of dealing with. So that's what I would say there. I don't know if that has fully answered your question, I'm sorry, but yeah, so does that make sense? So I feel like it's the emotional dimensions are actually shifting how we see the images, not necessarily what the images are showing. Yeah.
And I think there has been some research done as well by Axel Bruns and others that talks about Twitter as a far more political medium as well than the others too. But that was really great. That answered my question.
And Axel just got a laureate, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Looking forward to seeing what comes next.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you.
James?
Thanks, Danielle. Thanks for your talk, Constance. It's very interesting. And like Maria, some colleagues and I are also working in a very similar space, but from a different angle again. Luke, who's here today, and also Ali Muzaffari, we've been working on basically similar to what you're looking at. You're looking at diplomacy. We've been looking at how war plays out on Twitter and how Twitter warfare, looking specifically at the Armenia-Azerbaijan war that happened. It was a very short conflict that happened last year. And we're trying to do maybe extend it to a comparison of what happened in Gaza earlier this year as well. But essentially what we're looking at, which is very much related to, especially the feel and the other parts that you're talking about in your framework, is how that the different actors within the Twitter sphere behave, will essentially use it as a form of warfare on all sides. And we're talking about in English, in Armenian, in Azerbaijani, in Russian, also in other languages like Persian. So one of the things that came up was the use of, look, I'm going to focus on Azerbaijan a little bit because they were more successful. And one of the things that they did was they would share images and then delete them, which were of war crimes, essentially what we'd call war crimes. So the killing of POWs, the torture and killing of POWs and of civilians, which was really meant, it was done by a few of these bots that they were probably state sponsored. So that's also the ambiguous areas, and which is a question I actually have, which is the ambiguity of state and non-state, because there are also these whole Twitter sphere of bots who you don't know who they are. They sometimes presenting themselves as newspapers even. But they use these images actually to terrorize a little bit, because it kind of, on one hand, it got onto the Armenian Twitter sphere where they're saying, look at these crimes that they're committing. But the effect it actually had, I mean, I didn't want to open Twitter because of seeing these things every single day. And there was no repercussions for it. Of course, there were some supposed ones, but there was no real repercussions. So that technique in Twitter warfare of using horrific images, which we saw with ISIS to terrorize opponents, is part of, I think, the extension of that diplomacy. And these are coming from state accounts. A number of accounts that track them down, they link them to people who are essentially within the inner circle of the Azerbaijani government. Some of them, not all of them. But anyway, I just wanted to ask you to comment a little bit about that, because I think the importance of your work and what we're looking at is it's not just diplomacy, it's warfare in a short period of time where you can, I guess, capture an audience. We're trying to get to the bottom of what it actually achieves, because both sides do it. We think that the Armenian side was less successful in this, in all aspects of that war. But we wanted to talk to you a little bit about it. One other thing I just wanted to mention, just continuing this conversation about the difference between Twitter and other social media. I mean, I'm not trying to take the floor and everything, but definitely Telegram and Twitter are like almost the same thing. If you're working with Russian or Persian especially, and very often things appear on Telegram and before they appear on Twitter. And the thing about Telegram is that they share images and videos, and you can take them and then share them yourself on Twitter and almost claim them as your own. So Telegram is an interesting one to also look at. But I'm sure, I don't know, these things change from time to time. In Iran, it was Viber a couple of years ago. Now it's Telegram. So anyway, but sorry, just getting back to this idea of diplomacy, but also the extension of which is how it plays out in an actual conflict.
Yeah, thanks so much, James. That's, this is, you've made a lot of really, really great comments. I will say that definitely, I guess images are used, in order to provoke, it's a deliberate strategy. So they're harnessed by state and non-state actors alike to provoke particular reactions in a variety of ways. And definitely scholars who are looking at the use of those kinds of images in war, particularly across different platforms, like not only Twitter, but YouTube and so on and so forth. Ilan Manor is looking at a lot of this, and also Reese Crilly and Precious Chatterjee Doody as well, when they're looking at Russian campaigns and also the Israeli-Gaza war as well. So there are in international relations and media communication scholars who are looking at that definitely in terms of how that kind of is utilized or harnessed. So, and you're right, the ambiguity of state and non-state actors, I think, is again, that talks about, that kind of links to the point I made earlier about the ambiguity of domestic and foreign public. So in a lot of ways, how we think about things online and what's actually going on is very difficult to make those distinctions clear. We can see that as well, just in diplomatic engagement between Canada and Saudi Arabia, for instance, when Saudi Arabia responded to the Canadian Foreign Minister's tweet about the arrest of particular human rights advocates. I think this non-state aligned Twitter handle tweeted an image of the Canadian ambassador coming home, but there were kind of buildings in the background. So that was taken to signify something in particular, but it wasn't an official state account. So that then was also, but that kind of ended up being quite problematic as well. So I think in terms of what it achieves, I guess it's just, I guess it depends what the actors in the conflict are seeing as what an achievement is. So I think the difference is between what it's intended and what the audience response is and who those audiences are. So are they domestic? Are they within that particular area where, like, as you mentioned, Islamic State used particular images to talk to different audiences, so to talk to European foreign fighters, so they could come to Islamic State, to talk to women in particular, to come to Islamic State or come to assist the fighting, and or to be to come and be wives and so on and so forth, or are they talking to the political leaders? So I guess it's complicated in terms of who the audience is and whether the images themselves are intended for a particular audience, but then how they take on a life of their own. As you mentioned, you can move from Telegram to Twitter and claim it as your own, but you can't control what people are going to use that for. So I think that is something to like, and this is where it gets tricky, because methodologically it's complicated to know that, because we can't never know what's in someone's mind. We don't know what the intention is unless you ask them, but are they being truthful? And so the only way to really know that is to interview people, I think, but then that throws up a whole range of other methodological issues of itself. So I think Yeah, the only way to really know that is to see, well, what kind of statements are they making about the images? And this again is where you get to the point of thinking, well, are we taking the image as it's standalone outside of the text, or do we need to focus on the intertext of the image so that in itself has meaning? So it's not just the images they're showing, but what are they saying about the images? So when they're showing the images of dead prisoners of war, what are the language, what are the anchoring mechanisms that they're using for that? Are they just showing them and then taking them away and there's no text? Is there text to explain that? So I think that's something which it's less of a empirical question and it's more of a methodological question, I think. That's what I would start with, is thinking about, well, what do you want to know and how do you want to go about trying to find that out? Does that make sense?
Thanks, Constance. And I just wanted to say one other thing, which is also speaking to the importance of your work. In the recent conflict, I'm not sure if anyone here was aware, the chief cyber officer of Hamas was killed by the Israelis, deliberately targeted. And some of the analysis that came out of that was they were worried about not the effect that it would have on international, like the Hamas reaching the international community, but the effect that they could possibly have on Israeli society in spreading disinformation or information. So I thought I'd just emphasize the importance of your work and the real world consequences that it's actually happening now.
Thanks. That's a really good point. And you might be interested in, there's a work on recognition and humor and digital diplomacy kind of stuff by Rebecca Adler-Nissen and Alexei Tsinevoy, who look at Israeli representations of themselves and how this has been a really big deal, and how domestic people within Israel actually challenge this kind of state facilitated representation of Israel internationally. So it works on a number of levels. And this is, but there's I think the use of images as and disinformation, I think, is becoming much more problematic, and like the move towards concern about deep fakes as well, and how we can tell so definitely that's something that I think we're going to become more and more cognizant of as time goes on. So thanks, that's a really good point.
Thanks, Connie and James. It reminds me a little bit of the way North Korea uses images as well to try and refute some of the claims made by defectors. They doctor images and put together videos. It's a whole area of research as well.
Mm-hmm.
Umut.
Thank you, Danielle. Thank you. This was a wonderful, brilliant research, really. I really enjoyed listening to your talk. Thank you so much for your time. I always had this interest in images and this performative role of images in global politics. I just couldn't find time to read it in detail, but your talk was wonderful. So I'm mostly interested in the way in which we expose to refugee humanitarian crisis on Twitter. So my first question is the temporality of images, because you just gave the example of Aylan Kurdi and how the images and the tweets kind of shaped the response to these humanitarian crises. But then it disappeared because of because we stopped seeing all these tweets on Twitter. So my first question is, how does temporality of the images on Twitter affect the ways in which we see them? And the other question, it's not a question, maybe it's more about a comment, but you talk about it, which is so fascinating, the embodiment and how body and our phones or our computers and the images are all becoming together and affect one another and changing everything. Kind of our bodies are changing, the images are changing with all these interactions. So I'm wondering if, I think one theoretical contribution of this work is perhaps is new materialism, like talks about all these effective politics of images and the machines. And I'm wondering if you're doing anything in the context of new materialism or posthumanism, that kind of theoretical framework.
Thanks so much, Umut. That I would start with the embodiment question first. That's a really, really good point, and I hadn't even thought that what the work that I was doing is actually talking to that, but of course it is. But which is something that I'll look a little bit more into, because I'm interested as well. Like, I didn't have time to talk about it, but I go through in the paper about the physical manifestations of how we're seeing things like doom scrolling, and, you know, like, sorry, I'm doing that because I know this is what I do, you know, that kind of thing, you know, lying awake at night, you know, we're seeing the COVID numbers or whatever, and, you know, Melbourne, for example, and the kind of physical, you know, shifts around that and what we do, what that does to our bodies. And of course, new materialism certainly goes through that. And I was also kind of like the assemblages of that and what that means. So that's something that definitely I actually have to now, you know, take stock of more clearly, which is, yeah, so, and I'm not quite sure whether actually people in diplomacy studies have actually looked at that. They might have, I'm sure, but someone at some point would have. Maybe, but that's also a really interesting element as we, you know, move into the mediatization or digitalization of diplomacy and the co-option of Zoom, for instance. So people like Rebecca Adler-Nissen and Kristen Eggeling are looking at that a little bit, but the physical manifestation of that I don't think is necessarily something that is talked about enough. So definitely that's really great. Thank you. That's a really good point about the temporality of images on Twitter as well. And I think this goes to something that James might have mentioned too, in terms of like when we're thinking about, you know, not wanting to go on Twitter because you were seeing the images. It's like when we go, I'm just using the example of the Daily Mail. So when you scroll through the Daily Mail and you see these, you know, and they have terrible stories about things and the videos just start. And as you're going through, you know, and you can't unsee that. And it's similar to Twitter when you're going through, sometimes it just starts, right? But I think now you have to click on things a little bit more as well. So in a way, I think the immersive nature of it means that some images, depending on what we're interested in and who we are, will stay with us. So even if they're not iconic images, it still resonates within us because we can't unsee those things as we're scrolling through. And the interesting thing is that with the Alan Kurdi image, and Gabby Schlag talks about this as well, you know, was initially published in a Turkish magazine, like in like the back pages or something, as part of this photo essay on the so-called migrant crisis. And it only became really much, you know, broader than the kind of Turkish readership in Turkey because of the tweet of that image. So in a way, things that are supposed to be fleeting, you know, became actually a kind of a symbol for this broader discourse, the problems around it, the failure of politics to deal with this. So it's an interesting dynamic too, because I think the anchoring of things in a way that we kind of, you know, as human beings, we want meaning. And so sometimes, you know, these images, these iconic images play into how we feel and think about things. But the virtue of, not the virtue, but given the programmability of Twitter, we're just exposed to them so much and they change so much that it can be resonant for a moment but shift. And so it's important that we see the image not only as, you know, people might do analyses of iconic Twitter images, but also as a broader kind of body of images. So I think again it becomes this methodological question of what you want to focus on. And I talk a little bit about this in another paper I did about the what do you call it? It's not the importance of it, you know, but when some images resonate more than others. So you have Obama's image of himself and Michelle, you know, saying 4 more years. And that was one of the most retweeted images or liked images at that point in time. But there was also that young kid who wanted more nuggets from Wendy's or something. And so that became the second most like retweeted image. So you're kind of like, what, you know? So I think and that's part of the kind of programmability of the platform itself. So now I think one of the most retweeted or liked images is Chadwick Boseman's announcement of his passing. So that is something that I think has overtaken other images as well. So it's about how people feel about those images. I'm probably not making a lot of sense, but I think we think that the Twitter images are very temporal and fleeting, but actually when they become anchored as part of a discursive framing of events, or issues, then they become much more, the longevity of them is quite profound. So yeah, so I don't know, it's an interesting thing, but I think, you know, they have to be seen individually, but also as part of a broader body of images. But we can't unsee things. And I think that is what gets so interesting. And Sean Penn talks about this, you know, about the issue of morality as well, about his, he has an ethical, or at the time he had an ethical obligation to watch the beheading videos put out by ISIS because he didn't want those people's death to be not relevant or like not seen by someone. So there's also that kind of interesting question about when we're talking about humanitarianism as well, kind of what is advocacy, what is ethical participation? Is it actually viewing the images that, you know, did those people want people to see their deaths? But, you know, but this, you know, Sean Penn had a very strong reaction to it, where he felt that his ethical obligation was actually to watch all the videos in full, which very complicates the work that goes on in terms of the seeing, not seeing dilemma, as Frank Merler would argue. So I'm sorry, I know I waffled, but that was a really, really good question that I'll think more about. Does that make sense?
Thank you so much. This is just fascinating. Thank you.
It's been such a long time since I've, you know, had engagement. So it's partly why, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Connie. Yeah, it is really interesting, this question of the ethics of seeing. I know that at different times during the Syria conflict, I was looking for information around human rights, and there's some pretty horrific photos that different parties in that context share. And yeah, I can't look, and I feel bad for not looking, but then I think, well, maybe I shouldn't be looking. And yeah, you go back and forth with yourself, right? On those questions. I'm sure everyone has similar experiences on Twitter. I know when I'm trying to feel good, I go onto We Rate Dogs, and because that just makes me feel good. And it's not just the images, right? It's the cute little things that they say alongside it. Yeah. So, well, I think some people have a meeting to get to at 1. So I think that the 5 minutes break would be appreciated, unless anyone else has got any burning questions that they wanted to raise. I can see some people have already left to go off to their next meetings. I think we'll finish off there then. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that this seminar has helped you kind of think about this project afresh, and we look forward to seeing your publications that arise from it.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for your engagement and questions. This has been really, really thought-provoking, and I really appreciate, you know, being able to present this to everyone. So, and it was lovely to see so many people here, which is great.
Thanks, Connie.
I look forward to meeting some of you in person at some point.
Definitely.